Welcome to another episode of Bourbon and Rum. This is a podcast of two brothers from opposite ends of the spectrum. My name's Kent. I'm a rum drinker, and I'm from the left side of the aisle.
And I'm Kyle. I like bourbon, tend to be a little more conservative. Join us as we explore this experiment. Can two brothers from different sides of the political spectrum have a civil conversation and celebrate our differences?
What are you drinking?
Well, I'm drinking a bourbon that, I don't know, it's one of my favorite bourbons of all time, I think. And I think I drank it at one of our episodes, but I don't know if we really introduced or not, because I had recharged during an episode and I started drinking it. But I'm drinking Elmer T. Lee. It's a Buffalo Trace bourbon, and Elmer T. Lee was a master distiller at Buffalo Trace, and he pioneered the idea of single barrel bourbons back in the early 1980s. And his first single barrel bourbon was Blanton's. And so he came up with the whole Blanton's thing. And in his honor, they made another single barrel bourbon in his name. And I guess he actually, up until he died in 2013, he would actually select the barrels for it. But they have different mash bills at Buffalo Trace, and this is mash bill number 2. It's the same mash bill they use for Blanton's and Rock Hill Farms and some other ones. It's a really kind of sweet, it's kind of a vanilla caramely taste to it, but really smooth, really hard to find. And my crazy neighbor had gotten me a bottle of it. We exchanged bottles of bourbon for Christmas, and he went off the deep end on this one. So that's what I'm drinking.
Work
what do you
that
got
stuff down. Really cool.
Yeah. What are you drinking?
Well, I am drinking a gift from one of our faithful listeners.
Whoa.
Also happens to be my sister-in-law. But she got me a bottle of Dos Madeiras, triple-aged rum. All right, so this stuff is made in Barbados. It's then aged for a while in Barbados before it's put up. Then the barrels are shipped to Guyana, and they're aged for 5 years in Guyana. Then the barrels are shipped to Jerez, Spain, and they are aged another 5 years in sherry barrels, and then it's bottled. So it's triple aged.
Wow.
It's really good. I expected that it would be more molassesy because it's made in Barbados. I'm thinking like a English speaking kind of rum.
And it's so dark. I mean, it's crazy how dark that is.
But it's clean. It doesn't have much of it's got a very fine flavor, like a fine, refined Spanish speaking rum. It's ridiculously good. Really good. Very sweet.
Well, it sounds like
very sweet.
It sounds expensive.
Yeah.
Sounds pretty expensive if it's moved around that much.
I don't know what she paid, but it was worth every penny, I'll tell you. Tomorrow's a big day.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And then there's some other sideshow things happening during the day, like Trump's inauguration. So, but, I thought it would be interesting as we stand kind of at the hinge between two administrations. I'm as guilty as anybody. I throw things out all the time that I think, or that I think people should know, or that, but it's kind of an interesting moment. And I'm going to suggest that we discuss, what are the metrics that I'm on record saying that I hope Trump succeeds. How are we going to know what constitutes a successful presidency? And what I think would be cool is if we could agree on a number of measures that we think are important and meaningful. And there's some great data sources out there, and maybe we'll keep a scorecard going, and we can publish that on the podcast website and just see, where are we? Because there's a lot of folklore, but and truth to tell, it's a little hard to pick, what is important for you at what stage of life. But maybe we can spell out a few things that we agree that we think would be important to track. That was my idea.
Well, and for historical context, we could take them back an administration or two as well, because anything we pull, we can probably get something that is historical data too. That might give some good context.
Yeah, I took a swing at that a while ago. I picked the Kennedy administration and moving forward as kind of recent, and maybe that I don't know if that's a good measure, but that's a little over 60 years.
Yeah, it's a lot of time.
Kennedy administration feels closer to modern era than Eisenhower. You know what I mean? Like that seems like a kind
Yeah.
of a pivot. It's arbitrary, I guess, but seems like that would be a good way. And we can look at some data and we can pull some graphs. When you think about the economy being good, not only just economy, I think we should look at measures other than economics. But what
Well,
what matters to you? What do you want to see?
that alone, it's funny when you talk about, what statistics are important. Well, as everything is political, that's political too. I mean, what statistics matter to you probably depend on what the priorities were that your party supported. So, for instance, border crossings are probably not a metric. Illegal border crossings are probably not a metric that was high on the DNC's list of metrics to track, but it's certainly a metric that those that voted for Trump are looking to track. So there probably are some things like that that are like,
Sure.
depending on your perspective.
Well, I wrote that down. And what I'll do is after this, I'm going to do some research and I'm going to look for good data feeds that we can track this stuff on. But I think that's fair. If that's something that's really important to you, and you want to see how that changes over time. I don't know how far back we can go. We'll do the best that we can, but
Yeah.
let's lay it out there and see what that looks like.
Yeah.
What are other things that you would put on your Christmas list?
I think inflation is one that sticks out. And, that's the thing that I don't know. We talked a little bit about it, and we talked about like, what's your hopes, fears, or, at the beginning of the
Right.
year. And I think that's one that I don't know. I just feel like some of these economic metrics you can use and spin in a way, depending on what you're trying to spin them to, like they're not necessarily, it's like some of this stuff crosses administrations. And it's like, if your thing was, hey, it's not Biden's fault that the economy went bad, well, you'd probably say, well, maybe some of those things he inherited from the last guy. But then if you say, okay, if Trump's going to turn the economy around, but then you say, well, the inflation inherited from the last guy, it's like, I don't know, it just looking at it objectively, like, how do you say what is truly one guy's fault or another guy's accomplishment?
Sure.
Because it's not like these things happen instantaneously.
Right.
And it just seems like people will spin them to wherever they need them to look like.
Sure. Well, and I think that's why it would be important for us to come up with a balanced scorecard with a number of measures. Any particular measure, I think, and I know we have some listeners that we get feedback from time to time that like they're learning things on the podcast. So I don't want to talk down to people, but maybe to do a couple steps back on what some of these things mean as we're talking about them might be useful.
Yeah.
So inflation is broadly defined as kind of increasing prices over time,
Like the
right? And
CPI.
so, yeah. So a good one is the Consumer Price Index, and what that does, they actually do what's called a market basket. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has essentially like a grocery list that they go shop every week. And what happened to that shopping list? Did that price go up? But one of the things that you'll find if you watch these numbers often You'll hear people referring to inflation this and inflation that. But the truth is that it's like a layer cake or a sandwich of a variety of things that are moving. Food prices is one that tends to move kind of together. And we've had a lot of inflation in food prices lately. Eggs. We have a couple of rounds of bird flu, and eggs are really hard to find. But like oil prices and gasoline and home heating, those vary a lot, but they're not necessarily very correlated to movement in food. So we have things that we call core inflation that are normal things that people have to buy. And then you have energy as a separate track. And that can, that's what we had in the 1970s. You didn't have a ton of inflation on things except oil prices went up by 10 times. And that really put people in a hurt. You also have inflation in things like durable goods or stuff that you're going to buy it for a long time, your washing machines and dryers and cars, right? What happens with that? And so none of those prices, like when you hear that inflation was, annualized to 4% last year or whatever it is, probably no one of those items is moving up 4%, but the average, the whole basket together, you look at your bill at the beginning of the month and the bill at the end of the month, and it has gone up, and then you annualize that so you've got something to compare. So I think that's a really good thing. But to your point, the things that government has as a lever to control inflation often have kind of a delayed effect. So Biden took a big hit. You don't agree with this, but I'll tell you my perspective on this. Biden took a big hit for just skyrocketing inflation early in his term, first half of his term in particular. The number one thing that drives inflation up is government spending. And we spent a lot of government money in the pandemic. I'm not sure I'm saying that was even a bad idea, but you can't put, trillions of dollars in the PPP
Right.
into the economy and think that it's not going to have inflationary pressure later. So, I'm not trying to say, oh, it was all Trump's fault and Biden bears
Well,
no
but
responsibility, but
the bulk of the spending happened on Biden's watch. 20 and 21 were the biggest increases. I mean, it was like a multi-trillion-dollar jump. And I think that's the argument. Now, you could say the argument is he had to, and that makes sense. But
yeah, or that the decision, I think it was kind of bipartisan, but you can't blame Biden for anything that happened in 20 because he didn't get to the office till 21.
yeah, well, I looked at it and it was after he took office, the 2 years after he took office. I may have my dates wrong, but those were the biggest bumps. And, I get, like I said, it was an extraordinary period of time. I think everybody agrees with that for sure.
Yeah. I guess my point is that these measures, you do have to be a little bit informed at what you're looking at. And anybody who whips one number out of their backpack and says, see, that guy's an idiot, you're probably oversimplifying.
Well, biggest thing I blame Biden for coming out of the pandemic is the price of bourbon. Everybody was drinking more bourbon during the pandemic, and he's done nothing, Kent, to control the price of bourbon. It has gone crazy.
That's a hardship on the American family.
It is, though. I'm looking at the commodities that make up the CPI. So it's food and beverages, which consists of food at home and food away from home. And part of food away from home is alcoholic beverages. So they're in there. Housing, apparel, transportation, medical care, recreation, education and communication, and then other goods and services. And then they're weighted. It says housing typically makes up the largest portion, and then food, beverages, and transportation are big adds. So maybe that's something we could change, is to up the bourbon percentage in the CPI calculation.
That sounds like a platform on which to run.
Honestly, now I know this sounds like BS, but if we're making inflation, like, we can come up with these broad averages, but what about that? Like, what if we made our own, like, pick one of your everyday rums and I'll pick an everyday bourbon, and let's do a strike of the price at a liquor store tomorrow.
I like that.
I mean, because that's close to home,
I love that. Yeah. Well, you pick a rum and I'll pick a bourbon and I'll pick a rum, and we'll put that on our dashboard of how the country's going.
Well, the one I always use to gauge the prices between liquor stores is a handle of Woodford. So I'll do a
Okay.
handle of Woodford at one of the big stores like Specs or Total Wine.
Okay. I'll have to think about what I'm going to do. Yeah, let me give that some thought. But again, for our viewers, maybe who are not as geeked about some of this stuff as we are, one of the weird things about inflation, and again, why just spitting a number at somebody does not tell the whole story. You mentioned housing as a key part of CPI. And if you're a renter, seeing heavy inflation in the price of housing is really daunting to you. If you're a homeowner who's sitting on a 30-year mortgage at 2%, listen, housing prices can go up all they want. All that means is appreciation on my investment. And so you do have things that don't hit the population universally. And so that's part of the context you have to know if you're going to talk about economic indicators.
Well, and I think about gas. I mean, everybody goes off about gas prices, but okay, historically, I mean, $1 a gallon gas in 1980, and now it's $2 and something. I mean, it's pretty inexpensive overall. I mean, nobody wants to hear that, but it's like you're not going to keep it at $1 forever.
Well, right. And when you think about what that is, of course, you're in Texas, you're closer to production, but you know how they get that gallon of gas? They pump it out of the ground and run it through a refinery and then a pipeline to a truck to get it. I mean, I don't know. And, that Fiji water is actually, I think, more the gasoline if you get the quart size, like it's kind of insane.
Okay, so
I,
in 85, the average price of a gallon of regular gasoline in the US was approximately 112. When adjusted for inflation, well, in 2022 dollars, that's $3 a gallon. So that's
yeah,
about right.
right out of the money. Again, for our listeners, when we say inflation adjusted, or in certain today's dollars, for example, what we're saying is we add up what that inflation has been over those years, and we say what would the apples to apples price be of things. I'm going to throw a measure out there, an area or a topic of measurement I think is important, and I'm going to put it under two buckets. First, I'm going to say the unemployment rate. I think that's a really critical measure for our country. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a good one.
One thing that we need to track with this is not just the employment rate, but we need to look at the labor participation rate. And this can be a really so. I'll get the definition not 100% right, but the unemployment rate is defined as, I think it's the number of people who are not employed but are looking for work divided by the number of people that are employed. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks this. But a key to that is that the denominator is, or the numerator is those that are currently looking for work. What happens is there are people that literally drop out of the workforce. They're not employed. They're not looking for a job. They're not doing something productive for money in their life. And if they're not actively looking for a job, they don't count in the unemployment rate. And so this is an important thing to watch, and we need to track those two metrics together because you can have a really low unemployment rate, but a sizable portion of the population has just checked out and they're not looking for work, they're not involved. And one of the things we've been through a period lately, the last 10 or 15 years, of historically low unemployment rates, like really low. Historically, when I was studying economics as an undergraduate, you figured 4 or 5% unemployment was normal. Like that's what a healthy economy has. And we've been way lower than that for many years. It's not maybe as good a story as it looks though, because contained within that are people that have just checked out and they're not looking anymore.
Well,
And
I
so you
don't
got to look
know
at those two
though.
rates together.
I mean, pre-pandemic, I'm looking 2018. So right now, labor force participation rate is 62.5%. Unemployment at between 4.1 and 4.2. Pre-pandemic labor participation, easy for me to say, participation rate 62.9. So 0.5% higher. And the unemployment rate was 3.9. 3.7 to 3.9.
Yeah.
I mean, I would have expected that to be a lot different because after COVID, you had these people. Well, anecdotally, but you had these people that I don't want to go back to work. It's like, well,
Right. Well, and that's one that maybe isn't as meaningful on a month over month basis, but I think we should look at the trends as far
no,
back
it's
as we
good
can.
to. Yeah, it's definitely good. That would be an interesting one to see. Do you think that 62 per, oh, it's 16 or older. So that's pretty low when you think about it. Like 16 or older, only 62% are wanting to work.
Yeah. I mean, look, we should acknowledge that that includes people that are long-term permanently disabled, and I mean there are things that control that. But when you think about what that means for our society, that means that roughly two-thirds of the people over 16 are generating income. And what are the others living on? Social Security disability. Who pays for those? The people that are working. I mean, you can see the complexity of that. If that goes down, every time that goes down, that's a hit for our sustainability.
Well, the country with the highest, this is interesting, the country with the highest labor force participation rate is Qatar with 88%. Of
Wow.
course, that means, oh, a lot of those Middle Eastern countries, it's because only like 8% of the population is actually local. Most of the people are there to work. So most of those Middle Eastern countries have really high, but
That's
like
interesting.
Switzerland is 84%.
Wow.
But I guess, I mean, a European country, I mean, you got this really high minimum wage and everybody works a 35-hour week. Well, who wouldn't want to work with those kind of parameters, right?
Well, I, I mean, you're joking, but I mean, think about that. So I don't want to speak out of turn. I want to pull the numbers and we can look at it over time. But I know that it's been expressed as a concern of economists that our participation rate has gone down. And I don't know when we got to the mid 60s. I don't know if it was 70%
Yeah.
in the 90s or whatever, right? But as that's gone down, I mean, that is a serious concern for economists. And you wonder, would we be better off? I'm not making this pitch yet, but I'm going to tease this as a possibility. Would we be better off as a country to say, we're going to have a 35-hour work week with a robust minimum wage, and we're going to put 75% of our people to work because they're going to see that it is economically valuable to them. I don't know. If you keep minimum wage too low, you do stand the risk of people that are like, what have I got to gain by doing that? And would we be better off by bringing people back into the economy?
Yeah. That it would also be fun to overlay a statistic of what's your tax rate like, and how does that compare? It's like, which honestly is interesting though. Like, if you're in Denmark and you got a 65% tax rate, you might think, well, why bother work? That's a thing to think about is why is it? Maybe you're onto something. I mean, I'm not advocating for a 65% tax rate. Don't get me wrong. But
Right.
one would think if you got all these social programs and everybody's taken care of, and if you do work, 65% of your salary is going away, wouldn't you have less motivation to work? Yet, what's the labor force participation in Denmark?
Well, I think it points out that there's the real potential of risk there, right? If you raise tax rates repeatedly, it is a declining or a decreasing.
74.6%. They beat us
Yeah,
in Denmark.
yeah. I put tax rates on the list. And, the comparison of tax rates to other countries, I gotta say, that masks a lot because when you think about, yeah, you have huge tax rates in those countries with really strong safety nets, but your neighbors all pay the same taxes, right? Right? Like in some ways, like your salary and your tax rate, it's kind of an arbitrary concept. What matters is what you take home. Is their gross wages higher and their tax rates higher? And then at some point, does it even matter? The umbrage that people take about those high tax rates, but if your if your standard of living is comparable to your neighbors and it's comparable to your status in life and your education level. The fact that the frontline tax rate is really high doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad deal to be there.
Yeah, I mean, that's the nice thing about communism. I mean, if everybody's got the same stuff, it's all good.
Yeah. Well, we don't act like it's an either or, though. I mean, we've got some of those challenges here. I'm interested in your thoughts on this. I want to track markets broadly, and so I would say stocks, and I think we should probably look at Dow, S&P 500, and Nasdaq independently and see how those do. You agree that that's a worthy measure?
Yeah, that would make sense.
Part of what ticked this off is that I sent an article that said that on average stock indexes are up 55% since Biden took over an administration, which is great. It's not unprecedented, but it's great. You add that up over 4 years, that's a pretty good run.
Yeah, I think CPI we talked about, unemployment,
GDP?
GDP, consumer spending, consumer confidence.
Oh, let me get those.
PPI would be good also.
You mentioned PPI, that's the producer price index.
I think manufacturing job statistics would be good also.
Tell me more. Okay, we might be onto something. We might have our thing that we can argue, and I can throw things at the computer about. Why manufacturing jobs?
Well, I mean, I think it kind of goes back to what are people outsourcing? Why is it more appealing to do business elsewhere?
Okay. Okay, so you're looking at that as a proxy. I guess the part of the reason I bristle here a little bit is that I hear this stuff like we've got to bring manufacturing back to this country. And I don't know. I think when people say that, I think they're talking about steel and automobiles. But I look at the crap that I buy from Amazon that comes in on a shipping container from China, and I don't know that my hope is that my relatives and neighbors are going to work in plants stamping out plastic crap that we can just bring in from China. I'm not convinced that a manufacturing economy is as important or foundational as it's sometimes portrayed to be.
I think it's more about independence to a degree, economic independence and capability. If everything that we need, including ownership of our debt, is dependent on China, I think to some extent it's a national security issue as well. I mean, if we are beholden to China for everything, it's great if the spigot's flowing, but what happens when the spigot stops flowing?
No, that's fair. I wish we would be more strategic when we talk about that, about manufacturing. There's so much stuff that we use and consume that I cannot imagine making in this country in an economic way.
Well, but it's also, you know, there are things that we could make in this country that have gone away. There's probably some things that are just inherently not something we're going to be competitive at. But there could be things we could be competitive at if there wasn't barriers to entry. If you don't want to create a situation where you have to do it something here and prop it up. But there are things that possibly could be done here, but we can't get out of our own way.
No, I think that's a real concern. Don't.
And I think I do think there is a GDP contribution that takes place with manufacturing more so than, I don't know.
Service industry stuff.
Right.
Well, you get to count it multiple times as you bring in the raw materials and you refine the raw materials and you make the sub-assemblies and you roll that all up.
Yeah.
For what it's worth, I think especially things like heavy industry, I think it's good for us to have a foothold on that. But I don't get nervous when showing my bias here, but people are like, well, we're moving these jobs to China. Well, I think we ought to still build aircraft carriers here. I think we ought to build about 2/3 of the number of aircraft carriers we're planning to build. But and aviation and heavy stuff. Like I can see the national security angle to that. I just,
Well, so here's an example for you that I think I thought was fascinating. There's a company that I went to in California that makes aircraft batteries, and a lot of aircraft batteries some of the newer ones are lithium ion. There's NiCad and lithium ion are pretty expensive. Probably the most economical for small airplanes is a lead acid battery. Well, there's a manufacturer, for instance, in California that makes lead acid batteries, and they've had a lot of supply problems over the years. They make a pretty good battery, but they can't supply the industry enough because it literally, so like they've got a plant, and to make the lead acid batteries, you have to melt lead. Well, when you melt lead, it lets off an emission. Well, California has a cap on their output of how much lead, how much of this stuff you can melt. And so they're at capacity, and they've got demand for additional batteries, but they can't make any more batteries because they can't melt any more lead. It's like a pure capacity constraint. And it's interesting that, and this may not be the best example, but it's like, oh, well, we can't make it here. Well, let's outsource that to China. Well, okay, send it to China. Are they melting less lead in China? Like is there less emissions in China? No, it's okay to do that. So I don't know. It's funny. I don't know. That's probably not a brilliant example, but it's just, I found that really interesting talking to these guys. Like, yeah, I mean, we can add all the jobs we want, we can do all the stuff we want, but you can only melt so much lead.
right. I mean, and you're right. Like there's no way to get more lead acid batteries without melted lead. Although, this is actually a fairly interesting discussion because everybody bags on California because all of their legislation and their regulations. But it's not crazy on its face to say we want less lead melted in one of the most densely populated states in the country. I mean, it's a bad thing. And, to your point, it's bad wherever it goes, but, some of that is people don't want the lead melter next to their kids' school.
Well, and that to me is kind of like a microcosm of the whole EV culture. Like, oh, these things are great. Yeah, well, explain that to the poor bastard in Africa that has to mine cobalt.
Right.
Like,
Right.
it's not this clean, wonderful solution. It is for you if you're driving your EV in a fluid area.
Well, I think that underscores, I think the reason that we've got to look at all these measures and look at it in a comprehensive way is because there are trade-offs to it.
You know what? You said something that made me just think of, part of the immigration thing. I always laugh, like, and I know everybody's got different views on immigration. That makes sense. But it seemed like for the longest time, like the most common thing you heard from any politician, right or left, was we need comprehensive immigration reform. Like, no, I'm for comprehensive. Like, okay, what the hell does that mean?
Right.
And why doesn't anybody ever do it?
Yeah.
So,
Well, because stuff's hard. And
yeah,
the comprehensive in that case is the operative word. It's the hard word.
right.
And you can do one thing, you can make one intervention, but all of this stuff is a web. You pull on one
Yeah,
thing and you get unpredictable results down the road.
yeah. I think, hey, another metric, and I don't know how to measure it, but how did we measure international conflict reduction?
It's a tough one.
Because you could do like U.S. troops deployed, but I don't know we don't have troops in Ukraine or Gaza. So, I don't know if those really.
Yeah, that would be worthy of some additional research. I would be willing to bet that somebody's got a, international conflict score for the year that you can kind of measure. In sort of same way that they do human development index or something like that that averages up a bunch of stuff. I'll take a look and see if we can find something on that. That's a good call.
Here we go, Kent. I mean, you called it. The ACLED is the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. There's an Uppsala Conflict Data Program, the UCDP, the Global Peace Index, the Correlates of War Project, or the Heidelberg Institute for International Conflict Research, the conflict barometer. So yeah, there's a lot.
What about health? For a variety of reasons, both, kind of political interest and personal experience with healthcare and health quality in this country, I think, and again, I'm not trying to make these into polemic points as we throw them out, but one of the things I'd wanted to talk about at one point was, Obamacare, because I don't know, sometimes the Republicans are going to control the whole show, and like, are we going to just repeal Obamacare? And I think we should look at health outcomes and health spend. And I be willing to bet that many of our listeners do not know how badly we score as a nation on health outcomes compared to the rest of the developed world. It's kind of shocking. You think, oh, we've got it so good in this country. And people hear that there are wait times in England and Canada for care. Those are great anecdotes, but look at the outcomes. I mean, have you looked into that? Like where we stand on things like,
Mortality.
yeah, like prenatal mortality? Kind of shocking. I think we tend to think that we've got it great. Now, and I'm conflicted on this. I will be the first to admit, like I'm walking my fine line. The one thing that doesn't really worry me in this country about healthcare, like if we're ever going to get hate mail, like this might be the statement that triggers it. Drug prices, I think it's ridiculous what they charge for some of these drugs, but I want them to keep doing it because they keep coming up with drugs that, like, the United States in particular, and I think it's probably a function of the inefficiency of our healthcare system. We are a world leader in ginning up new medications. And the fact that if you come up with the right medication, you can get rich on it big time in this country, that drives that. And I get really
Well,
nervous when people talking about limiting health pharmaceutical profit.
well, yeah, I don't know about limiting the profits, but I do think, you know, we talk about conspiracy theories, and one of the conspiracy theories that I think has some truth to it is the pharmaceutical industry and what, is their goal improved health, or is there a goal pharmaceutical profits? And I'm a free market capitalist, so I'm okay with making profit, but at the same time, part of a capitalist society is also making choices based on who you want to buy crap from. And I feel like there may be gaps there that we don't, we think everything is fine with these medications, but some of these medications, it's kind of like, that whole thing. Like if there was a drug that could cure cancer, okay, I was listening to a podcast, and you can call me a conspiratorial nut job, but it was actually Joe Rogan, and he had a guest, and he said, "Hey, I know guys that had cancer. Again, you're going to laugh, and I'm okay with that. But they took ivermectin, and they're cured of cancer. Now, I'm not saying ivermectin cures cancer. I'm not hanging my head on that. But I guess what I am saying, though, is if something of no cost and no profit potential cured something that generates a shitload of profits for people with other drugs, would they migrate to the thing that doesn't generate profits but would help the people? That's the part that I think that's the missing component in the system to me, is that the pure profit motivated approach. And again, I'm a capitalist, but like, how do you keep that in check? Right? Because
Right.
that doesn't necessarily motivate the right behavior.
Well, I think actually the biggest issue with that is that there's no profit for taking an existing drug and uncovering a new use for it. And so
Right.
I was talking to a guy who does this philanthropically on his own. There are drugs out there that have been found to have really broad, unexpected positive impacts. And if you go out there and you find that this drug is actually, you take it for your cholesterol, but it's actually protective against Alzheimer's. The problem is that there's no profit to be beat out of that. And you
Right.
don't have to have, unfortunately, you don't have to have an evil conspiracy. You just have to have a thing where Nobody's going to make any profit on this thing. And the FDA has a steep bar that you have to get over to prove that medication works. And so who's going to pay for that? Well, this guy, I think, actually was a really brilliant idea, taking philanthropic dollars to look for drugs that have promise. And he said, I'll pay for the testing. If we think it's real, and there are researchers who will tell you that there are drugs that we're using right now for say whatever it is, and there's a really good likelihood that it's valuable, protective against Alzheimer's or some kind of
Yeah.
long-term chronic disease. Well, there's nothing to pay for the testing, so if they philanthropically pay for the test, they got nothing to gain from the end of it, but they've done something good. One way you could address that is by increasing funding through the NIH for orphan drug results. You could use government dollars to pay for research to things. And the predicate of that is not just a giveaway. Like,
You could do
where do you think you pay for the really expensive expensive diagnoses late in life? Medicare.
you could pay for gain of function research in Chinese laboratories.
Well, you never know. Once in a while, I think it's interesting because government's got a big stake in that. The other thing, and I'm all right. This would be an interesting research project. What percentage of the population is covered by private health, and what percentage of the population is covered by the following health insurance options: Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE, the
Yeah.
Veterans Administration. You go through the list and like, oh yeah, we're all free market except all of the old people, all of the poor people, all of the injured people.
Right. Totally. Well, I was talking, it's funny, I was at church this morning and kids were talking, and I was talking to the dad, and he works in compliance at a hospital system here in Fort Worth. I brought up the whole thing, like, okay, what I was trying to understand from him, like, what is the dividing line between, like these private ERs that they can refuse service if you don't have insurance, but the hospital, he said, it's all about, if you take any government money, if you take Medicare or Medicaid, you have to take in any indigent person that has a problem. But and he brought up a good point. He's like, yeah, I mean, if you come in and you got a life-threatening condition and you can't pay for it, we're going to put them in a intensive care. We're going to take care of them. But if they got cancer, we'll take care of whatever the urgent thing is, and then we're going to let them go. But it's not going to take care of their cancer. And it was a good point of like,
Yeah.
You're going to provide acute care, but you're not, to your point, you're not really providing health care. You're providing medical support, but health care is like, how do we get you healed of cancer or whatever's wrong with you?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, okay, here's a government program I could get behind that I think would make a massive value. I think the government, and again, I'm saying this is a small government kind of guy here, but I think you talk about a huge dividend, make Ozempic, Mounjaro, Zepbound free to anybody with a BMI over 25 in the US.
Mm-hmm.
Get everybody in a healthy BMI. How much money would that save in entitlement programs?
Well, and in fact, I'm with you 100%, and I'll go deeper than that. And I'll say, this is one of those things where you look at the landscape of our healthcare, right? People get fat and unhealthy, looking at my own image on the screen, right? People get fat
Same.
and unhealthy when they're in their working years and they're stress eating and they're hitting drive-throughs because they're working too hard, right? So you get fat, and it causes you problems when you're in your late 50s, your joints hurt, right? Like, it causes problems. But the real price of that is paid when you get to Medicare and you've got type 2 diabetes and you spend every other
Right.
week in the hospital. And so you would have incurred the cost for the drug maintenance 30 years before.
How much of our Social Security disability spend is on that? Is
A ton.
obesity.
A ton. Of course, and this is like the most horrible thing to say, but we're talking about data, not about human beings here, although we're talking about human beings. If we do that, if we crack that code, we give everybody the drugs, we lose the weight, diabetes goes to nothing, life expectancy goes way up.
Yeah.
Oh, oops. Then we got to increase the Social Security contribution rate because you got all these people living a long time. I mean,
No, well, no, that's when the Logan's Run law is going to come into play. So as soon as you hit 35, you're getting zapped,
sanctuary. I looked at a clip of that just the other day. We'll have to have the producer link that. You talk about bad 70s science fiction. It is rough.
Yeah,
But it was filmed, wasn't Logan's Run? Wasn't it filmed in Fort Worth?
yeah, the end scene is in the Water Gardens, Fort Worth Water Gardens. But honestly, I think that was one of the first movies I remember you getting on videotape and watching. I remember you got it one time when we were kids. It was like, man, this is a great movie. I still watch that. Like I don't know, there's a sentimental quality. But now as I watched it, I'm like, man, the special effects aren't great. Yeah,
It's not good. Well, I think this is exciting, Kyle. I have
yeah,
identified from our conversation today 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, at least 17, 18, 19 possible data points that we can track. And we can roll those up into a scorecard and a barometer. And then, the great thing to do would be that we would agree on what to weight to come up with an algorithm. But I think that becomes the hard part. I think you and I both agree that this list of things is probably the kinds of things that we ought to be watching.
what about
But where the
crime?
hard part
We
comes
didn't put we didn't
is,
put crime. How about a crime factor?
well, crime. I mean,
Hmm.
yeah, yeah, we'll put crime on there.
Yeah,
Um,
the now and then the other thing now, I'm gonna have to watch where you're pulling your stats. I mean, if I see anywhere that you're pulling stats from, you know, some Atlantic report or NPR, we'll have to.
I'll send you back a proposed set of sources that we can get those data from. A lot of these are going to be, I assume that we can trust the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or are they
Yeah,
also
I think
communists?
governmental agency for the most part. What about are we going to track the number of times Trump stumbles? Is there a stumble metric of some kind? Like Trip walking up the stairs or Gerald Ford metric of some kind?
It would be hard for that to be worse than what we've had for the last 4 years. So, um, well, I think this is cool. And
Yeah, this is great.
we'll put it together as a scorecard and we can kind of watch the movement over time. I think, especially insofar as we can find historical data on this, I think it'll be really interesting to look at, what the initial work I did on this a little while ago, a much smaller data set or, a shorter list of metrics, but and admittedly it was me picking the metrics, but I thought it was really interesting because some of the classic metrics that you would say of a good economy, GDP, inflation, unemployment, for example, those kind of core measures, even among Democrats, there is a folklore in this country that Republican presidents are better for the economy. And I don't think that that's true. I don't think that Democrats are inherently better either. These measures move sometimes in opposition to one another, and you've got to take it as a whole. But, by most measures that you can imagine, the economy under Bill Clinton's second term is hard to beat from any other administration, either side. Oh, budget deficit. That's what I was going to put on there.
Yeah, that's like you say, debt and deficit are big ones also.
Yeah, but deficit and total debt, and that's particularly interesting. Again, some of our viewers may not catch that. Deficit's the difference between the annual total of what the government receives in taxes and what they spend, and that's since the Clinton administration always been a negative number. We always spend more than we bring in. When you do that, you put that on the giant credit card in the sky, and the accumulated debt that we have is the federal debt. And a lot of people think it's inherently bad for the government to have debt. It's actually not. If our government didn't have any national sovereign debt, our banking system wouldn't exist. the predicate of a reliable government payment of bonds at fixed interest rates is one of the things that underlies the entire banking, finance, and insurance industry. And if the government weren't a player in that, you would have a really hard time pricing things out. So it's not necessarily bad, but we're also seeing historically high budget deficits and a historically high U.S. government debt as a percentage of our actual output or GDP.
Well, and then it's also, back to the issue of how much of that debt is foreign owned, and where is that foreign owned? China
Oh,
China holdings represent 9.5% of all foreign held U.S. Treasury securities. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well,
it's not like they own your mortgage. Like they can't choose, I mean, part of the way government debt works is they say, here's what we're going to put out there. Here's what we're going to pay. Take it or leave it. So China may have that debt, but they don't really have the ability to, if anything, they're the authority that they wield in that, the power that they have is to quit buying our debt. They can't really do anything about the debt that they already own. You take whatever
well,
we give
and
you.
to some extent, I mean, you're thinking about that. I mean, first, that's bad that your potential enemies have a big ownership stake, but it could be good too. It's like, well, they're not going to nuke us because there goes, $1 trillion of their wealth.
That's 100% true. And ultimately, that's the way sovereign debt works. If you make us really mad, we're not gonna pay your bonds. We'll pay the other bonds. Good luck. Come get it.
Well, I think this goes back to those. Where is the trying to evaluate the efficacy of a presidential administration based on metrics like GDP growth? Well, some of the highest GDP growth was like, well, FDR had huge GDP growth because we came out of the recession. Well,
Uh-huh.
I mean, is it because he's a genius or is it because we came out of the recession? I mean, you know what I mean? It's like,
Totally.
whoever came out of the recession was going to have killer stats.
Right.
Now you could say, well, it's because of him we came out of the, like, oh, okay, I mean, that's another story. But I mean,
No,
it's like,
I mean, I think that's part of though what argues for a broad basket of measures rather than just saying, and that's one of the things that honestly bugs me. And this goes back as far as Ronald Reagan. Well, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? There's a lot of factors. I mean, it's not an unfair question, but there's a hell of a lot going on behind the scenes rather than just who happens to be the president.
yeah,
My
right.
life was very different 4 years ago than it is now, and it just to me it points up the fallacy of you pick one measure and say, see, everything's good. I don't
Yeah,
think that's really true. I think what we're going to find, and if we look back at this historically over administration, you're going to find Republicans that did great on GDP and Republicans that did terrible on GDP. You're going to find Democrat administrations that did great on the national debt, and there's going to be those that have been terrible. And really, it's a multifactorial thing. The risk is that there's so much complexity there that it winds up being a mirror, and your guy looks good to you. And
yeah.
I think the challenge is to try to get past that a little bit and to be thoughtful about
Do we need to measure? Here's a subjective one: approval ratings. That's another one that you could toss into the mix. I mean, it seems like every president has a downward trend. They like him at first, then they hate him by the time it's over.
I think that's just proof that they're never as good as you hope that they're going to be.
Right.
All right. Well, I got some homework to do on this. I think this is going to be a fun project and a nice adjunct. We'll have to, we don't want to get too granular because it'll lose something. But maybe once a quarter we have we have the presidential midterm review. We'll have a conversation about whether we think he's on target or not, and we'll
Yeah, that
break it
sounds
down.
good.
All right. Well, I think I'm going to let you go for now and call it. But it's been a great time to talk to you, pal. Thanks.
Yeah, same, Kim. Thanks.
Hey, thanks for joining us on this episode of Bourbon and Rum Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Remember to subscribe on your favorite platform and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us keep the good spirits flowing.
And we invite you to join this conversation. Follow us on our Facebook page. Let us know what you think. Let us know what you want to hear.
And until next time, cheers.